I'll get you some water. Sorry.
Yeah. Thanks,
Be
Mama.
careful with the water and the laptops. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Now, this event is being live streamed, so if you're watching via the internet, hello, you're in the Blavatnik School of Government. If you haven't seen us before, we are the youngest department in Oxford, and our vision is to do what we can to develop a world that is better led, better served, and better governed. And it's my huge honour, in fact, absolutely a perk of my job, to introduce Professor Thuli Madonsela. Now, currently, Professor Madonsela teaches constitutional law at Stellenbosch University, where you hold the Law Faculty Trust Chair for Social Justice. And in recent years, she has become famous for investigations into state capture in South Africa under former President Jacob Zuma. And I'm sure we will discuss that in some detail. But before I hand the floor over to Professor Madonsela for 20 minutes or so, I wanted to actually highlight some of her prior experience working on social justice in South Africa. Now, some of you may not know that back in the mid-90s, she was part of the team who drafted South Africa's constitution. And in the years around then and shortly after, she pushed very hard for gender equality as well as racial equality, especially in reviewing and interpreting customary law in terms of its underlying values. In 2007, she was appointed full-time member of South Africa's Law Reform Commission, and she became public protector for 7 years in 2009. Now, all of these achievements have led to many, many awards, far too many to list, from organizations such as Transparency International. She's even been one of Time's 100 most influential people. So we are incredibly honored and privileged to have her here today. The format for today's session is Professor Madonsela is going to speak until about 6 o'clock. And then I will open the floor to questions, and I'm gathering that there will be quite a few when I see some faces in the audience. And then I have to tell you that there will be drinks for everyone here afterwards in the forum outside, and you are all invited. So we will end today's session at about 6:45 at the latest, so we can all have hopefully a glass of wine before we finish properly. Over to you.
Thank you, dear colleague, and thank you to everyone who has been here. What a privilege to be back at Oxford. When we think about injustice, what comes to mind? When we think about governance, what comes to mind? And the question is there an intractable conflict between injustice and governance? That's something that divides political parties across the board. Not so long ago, I had tea with a famous and formidable politician, and during our tea discussion, it was clear that she's committed to good governance, she's committed to a functional democracy, but she doesn't think that should include social justice. And the question many young people ponder is, can there be democracy, true democracy, without social justice. A while ago, as South Africans, we proudly presented ourselves to the world as the Rainbow Nation. Bishop Tutu, who is celebrated in this country as a champion for all that's good, particularly human rights, is said to be the person who coined that name for us, the Rainbow Nation. And it came at a time when in South Africa there was an atmosphere of a new dawn. We had just conquered apartheid, more than 300 years of colonialism, and we were embarking on a new journey. And that new journey included having adopted a constitution that states that, among many other things, we seek to become a democratic society that is based on social justice, human dignity, and human rights. Very recently, when President Zuma exited and President Ramaphosa came, South Africa again was caught in this euphoria of a new dawn. Only this time, the idea of a rainbow nation was not part of how people were defining themselves. It is said that democracy everywhere in the world is in crisis. During my term as a pub protector, I was confronted with that reality of democracy under threat. And that's one of the reasons I chose to take this professorship that goes with being a chair in social justice research, because I really thought that it could make a difference in places where, as public protector, I couldn't make that difference with my limited power. And in June 16, 2017, we gathered with young people to reflect on an anniversary of June 16, 1976. And the idea was to look back and say, what did young people want in 1976? And by 2017, how much of that had been achieved? One of the people in the room had been a 12-year-old on June 16, 1976. And she was arrested for fighting against injustice. In that particular case, they were fighting against the use of Afrikaans as a language of instruction and the use of Bantu education, what was called Bantu education, which was a new model of education that had been introduced in African schools to dumb down the quality of products of that education, so as to create a labor reservoir and destroy the ability to be entrepreneurs, to be professionals, and many other things. So she had been arrested. When we met her on June 16, 2017, she said something that shocked us in a room like this. She said, "We don't want democracy. My contemporaries and I fought for freedom, and we got this thing called democracy. We don't want it." Of course, Palisa Musa was arrested at the age of 12 and harassed. For 6 months, she was in prison and treated under the most inhuman conditions imaginable. Conditions where they were not even allowed to wear panties, except when they could prove by showing blood to the wardens that they were menstruating. That's just one of the indignities that she had gone through, and that affected her immensely. In the end, her education was arrested, and she's poor even though she works hard today. So you could say maybe it's the poor that don't want democracy. But at an event like this organized by GIBS, one of the premier institutions in South Africa, a young lady by the name of Nometa, who is an LLM, she's a master's graduate, said, "We don't want democracy. Our parents fought for freedom, and we got this thing called democracy. And we don't want it, we want freedom." You'll agree with me that underpinning that thought is a suggestion that there's a tension between democracy and freedom. There's also a suggestion that you can have democracy without freedom. But also a suggestion that democracy is a problem. We've since had many democracy dialogues, but one that interested me was one that took place on the 24th of September, 2018, when young people said we need a new name. This rainbow nation doesn't work. It never did. We never were a rainbow nation. Incidentally, a graduate of this university, Hosi Chikane, who's also a master's graduate, recently wrote a book, Breaking the Rainbow, or Breaking a Rainbow, Building a Nation. And he says, "We were sold dreams. We want a refund." Again, talking about South Africa's democracy. And during a social justice cafe between the Tuma Foundation and Stellenbosch University, ambassadors, where they were talking about dear presidents, the whole issue of identity again, the whole issue of having been sold dreams was said by many young people. What seems to be emerging is that a lot of people don't believe in democracy anymore. And a lot of people don't think good governance is worth it, or even there's anything good about good governance. What happened? In South Africa, we have a groundbreaking constitution. In the rest of the world, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Above national constitutions, as early as 1945, visionary leaders across the globe created the UN Charter on human rights and followed up with the 1948 Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which puts social justice at the center of it all. In South Africa, we have a constitution that includes a vision of a democracy that is built on social justice and freedom for all. It promises the freed potential of every person. It promises an improved quality of life of every person. It also promises everyone basic entitlements, what you refer to as human rights. Some of those are social, some of them are economic, and some are normal civil and political rights. I mean, the social and economic rights include normal ones like the right to education, not to access to education, it's the right to education, right to basic education, right to a higher education, except that the higher education right is progressive. And it promises people access to food, access to health, Section 27, access to social services. Built into that constitution, beyond the rights, we even have the right to the environment, by the way, as everyone is concerned about climate change and the degradation of our planet. We have a constitution that defines clearly the character of the state that can lead South Africa to this new state of being an inclusive democracy based on social justice, freedom, rule of law, and many other values. the character of the state, key within that is integrity. Key within that is ethical governance, which is enshrined in Section 95 and also in Section 96 for members of the executive. Another important part of the character of the state when it comes to the issue of justice is Section 237 of our Constitution, which says constitutional responsibilities should be given priority and performed diligently. Well, the rest of it is diffuse state power and a polycentric accountability framework. That polycentric accountability framework includes having Chapter 9 institutions or institutions that are created by Chapter 9 of the Constitution. Here in the UK, for example, you've got an ombudsman office. In South Africa, they took that concept, that Swedish concept, and built on it something even more powerful that has coercive power or binding powers. And its power goes beyond maladministration and also deals with corruption and unethical conduct by members of the executive, including the president. So you would have thought that if you have a constitution that is so clear in its architecture, things should be good. There should be a clear balance between governance and justice. Well, why is Palisa Musa saying we don't want democracy? If we have a democracy with this beautiful architecture, why is Hosi Chikane saying we were sold dreams? We want a refund. Well, I thought we should dissect the dissonance between reality and the promise. The first thing that I have picked up and that we picked up in our research now in the social justice chair and the M-Plan team at Stellenbosch University is this policy dissonance. There's a difference between what you're trying to achieve and what you are achieving. Most of the times when policies are created, there isn't a data analytics aspect to it. And we're not the only ones. Many countries have an economic policy that is based on what the economists predict is going to be fine for the nation. And there's always the emphasis on GDP, although we say these days we talk about GDP plus, but the starting point is still GDP. And GDP, of course, is the average income. It could literally mean 1% of your population is earning most of that money, and a huge percentage of your population is earning none of that money, as is the case in South Africa today. 55.5% people are poor, 64.2% of blacks who are African, of African descent are poor. In one province, poverty is at 72%. So there is a dissonance between what the Constitution says we should be doing and what the policies are trying to achieve. But one of the things that you who are scholars at Oxford today, being a country, one of the countries that colonized South Africa, is that I always find that when Africa decolonized, it still got advisors from the colonizing countries. And of course, with all of their good intentions, their frame of reference would be what they know, not what should be. In South Africa, exactly the same thing happened when it came to policies around economic restructuring. We have a constitution that is not about building a viable economy. We have a constitution that is about building a livable country where everyone's humanities are affirmed. So that ideally that should be the starting point. South Africa should be more like Sweden, where the starting point is how do we create a country where everyone's humanities are affirmed, and how do we use money or the economy to build that? Do you understand? It's not like the economy and then the rest around it. But what has happened since 1994? The opposite. How do we build an economy that keeps growing? Growing for who? it's a question mark. And I'm not saying it is evil people that have done this. It's just people kept doing what they knew. And a lot of the people that advised were the people that had built the economy we found. For example, we took so much trouble under Mandela to build a law called the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act. I remember one party fought against it, but in the end, it was done. It was constitutional legislation. 20 years into the passing of that legislation, Chapter 5 of that Act is still not implemented. And that Chapter 5 is about conducting an audit into disparities and then progressively addressing them. The interesting thing is that institutions like Stellenbosch have done exactly what the Equality Act wants them to do. But Stellenbosch is an intellectual institution. They know that if you're going to address inequality, you've got to do it progressively. I'm not saying they've always done that, but I'm saying as we stand right now, they're doing that. But there are institutions that don't know that you firstly have to do an audit of what are the disparities, what is the nature of those disparities, yet we have an act that is an instrument to do that. What happened to it? Just as this act was about to be completed, our Treasury Department came up with a different act called the Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment Act. And we now get told that the brother of the outgoing Minister of Finance sponsored that act. His name was Baron du Plessis. But BEE was the old economics, where you want to use a trickle-down economic approach, where the idea was the existing vehicles, economic vehicles in South Africa would then absorb others through BEE. So if a company has absorbed 25% blacks, it becomes black empowered. The weird thing is that that law has created an environment where actually a company that is 100% black is legally less black than a company that is 25% black, because of the other indicators for BEE that were created. But you will understand that they were created by somebody who needed the status quo to be kept as much as possible, and they came up with that vehicle. And today, BEE has been a failure. The notion of empowerment of people is not a bad idea. The interesting thing is that the Constitution doesn't talk of black empowerment only, because you and I know that inequality in South Africa was race, primarily gender, disability, and others, but also there's intersectional issues. So once you have an act that only singles out one issue, those who are victims of compound discrimination, compound exclusion, are going to be left behind. And that's what has happened. But again, if you're going to focus on the economy and leave the education system, where we know that there were disparities in how the cake was distributed to schools. For example, by 1994, for every 4 rand that was invested on a white child, only 1 rand was invested in a black child. So obviously, if we were going to deal with those disparities, you would have had to do investment that is slightly different. And today we still speak about schools that don't have toilets. But I'm not going to blame the past for schools without toilets. I would say some of it was policy dissonance, some of it was, of course, corruption. The judiciary has been one of the greatest anchors of social justice in South Africa. Great cases. One of the most recent cases is Daniels versus Kribante, where Judge Edwin Cameron, who just became Chancellor of Stellenbosch University, he talks about the past is with us, and until we reckon with it, it will not leave us alone. And obviously, Ben Turok talks about those continuities. Some of us talk about the past as the ugly shadow of the past that really must be dealt with. But while I'm saying the judiciary has done a great job, it's mostly some of the high courts and the Constitutional Court. So the average Gogo Dlamini, the average grandmother, the average ordinary person has to go to the magistrate's court, has to go to the high court. It's taken one high court, for example, to deal with disparate treatment in auctions. You know, what we call foreclosures. Foreclosures, everyone is treated the same, but the impact is to exacerbate disparities of the past. One of the cases that, as Tuma Foundation and Stellenbosch University Law Clinic and Social Justice Chair got involved in, was a case where this guy had a house that was worth about R500,000. You can do a translation to pounds somehow. Is it 25,000 pounds? All right. Let's leave it that way. Let's leave it to the economists. In this particular case, he was owing the bank some money, and the bank decided to foreclose. And when this home went on sale, on auction, it was sold for 40,000 rand. It was 500,000 rand, almost 500,000 rand. It was sold for 40,000 rand. Of course, we thought this was improper, and we engaged with Standard Bank, and they also agreed it was improper. But at the end of the day, it's a systemic problem. So only one high court took up this matter, Justice President Mlambo, who knows how it feels to go without food, who knows how it feels not to have money to buy a home. Because if you're talking about historic disparities in South Africa, you're talking about a monopoly board where some of your players, let's say you had a team of blues and pinks, that you decided the pinks can't play for quite some time until all of the properties have been bought and the other team have had significant rounds around and collected money from the bank if you've played Monopoly. And then after a while, you then say, now guys, we are equal. The pink team can come and play. And I know there are people who call themselves liberals, and I think they're libertarians, they're not liberals, who say that equality means when you say, now pink come in and play, that's equality. To start saying you're going to have policies that are going to try and give pinks a boost so that they can catch up with the blues, they say that's discrimination. But trust me, not only will the pinks be always behind, but the distance between the pinks and the blues will increase, because inequality operates exponentially. If me and you right now, I keep giving you 50 rand for every 500 rand I get, in 5 years' time, the distance between me and you would have multiplied as opposed to remain constant. So it has to take a disruption to change it. But there are grown-ups who say you don't need that disruption, and if you come up with that disruption, it is anti-democracy, it is... And then they also say it undermines good governance, but I'm going to come back to that. So there's been a bit of judicial patchwork because the Gauteng one said, okay, everyone is treated the same with these auctions, but at the end of the day, it perpetuates historical imbalances because black people, until 1991, were not allowed to own property, to own immovable property, any. A law was passed at some stage during apartheid disallowing them from owning property. So you don't have a social memory of owning property. But secondly, you don't have a social network where your collateral can come from somebody in your own network, from a mother, an uncle, or a wife, or somebody like a husband. You dealing with other people who are equally poor. So the people who are likely to lose their homes are going to be the historically disadvantaged. And this is what was happening in Gauteng. And when this matter was addressed, it also improved governance because the Judge Mlambo, discovered that auctions are still based as if we are in the 19th century. Literally, the advert is put in the corner of the master's office because towns used to be one-street towns and everyone moved around that street, and at some stage they will see the advert. So in the end, anyway, everyone was losing because the amount of money you would get from an auction would be from 2 or 3 people that would be bidding in the room, and it would be the usual suspects who know when auctions are taking, and they come and buy these houses for next to nothing, and they put them on the market immediately. And corruption has also been a problem. And trust me, corruption has not been only from the ANC government. And I think most of you know the corruption from the ANC government because it is a national government. And obviously, the bulk of corruption will be from it. So everyone knows about Nkandla, everyone knows about against the rules. But nobody knows about this can't be right, which was Midvale, where poor people who were owing a municipality as little as 5,000 rand. 5,000 rand. Somebody who was the lawyer for the municipality, the auctioneer for the municipality, and everything would encourage these people to donate the property that was owing, to donate it to the municipality, and then immediately have this on auction. And his firm was the auctioneer, and they would sell it on auction for next to nothing, but to cover the value of what's owed to the municipality, and then immediately put it in the open market for a fortune. And this was Midvale. It wasn't an ANC, it was a DA managed municipality, and it still is. So I think, again, it's not surprising that corruption comes in many packages in South Africa, because according to history, there was corruption in South Africa. It's one of those continuators. And Madiba did say that if we don't put a handle on it, it was going to get bigger than us. And of course, the Zuma years, it really did go unhindered. Another problem that I would say in terms of dissonances is civil society has tended to be bystanding when it comes to governance, except when it reaches a crisis. And we saw that with state capture, when everyone went up in arms when they realized that the country was about to go up in smoke, when evidence seems to suggest that the Guptas are getting a whole lot of tenders and overpricing things. Just lastly, to end, I do think that there are 3 key pathologies that are preventing us from fully living to our potential as a country, and probably for the rest of the world. In South Africa, one of the pathologies is that there's one camp in South Africa that thinks before Zuma, everything was great. If we can just retrace our steps before Zuma, we'll be fine. I've just written an article that will come out in the Financial Mail where I'm saying, no, actually, the inadequacies of the before Zuma period were the reasons we had Zuma, because it was partly the fight back by the left behind. But secondly, Zuma was enabled by the lapses that were beginning around ethics, how we were holding people to ethical standards in terms of Section 195. The second group, a pathology, I'm about to conclude. The second pathology is that the Zuma camp, they've produced a 50-page document that they sending to universities and to townships that says basically Zuma was crucified because he was fighting for the poor. He was the voice for social justice and he was making a difference. The truth is, Zuma never made any difference on social justice. In fact, the 2 things that people credit President Zuma with are things where literally on his way out of the door, he passed 2 bucks to President Ramaphosa. Literally after 9 years of office, he passed 2 bucks to President Ramaphosa. Fees must fall and the land issue. Literally, all he could do was make a promise and say, the guy coming after me will see how the promise gets made. But he had 9 years to do that. And if you look at his 9 years in terms of his advocacy, in terms of his policies, you're not going to see. In fact, he's the only president since democracy who never ever mentioned the Equality Act. Not once. Because during President Mandela, it was passed. During President Beki, he was trying to have it implemented incrementally, and then he didn't finish it. But the last pathology, dear good people, is, or with the Zuma period, the other one about him being a saver is that he was an advocate for radical economic transformation. Again, check his pronouncements. His mentioning of the word radical economic transformation only comes once I started the investigation of state capture. But they're writing this document where they're telling people that he's being punished for this. Yet all of these things that he claims to have been punished for, he only remembered them after the state capture investigation had commenced. But the sadly is, not everyone is at Oxford or at Wits or at Stellenbosch and they're doing an analysis. They just take the document that they've been. Interestingly, a 50-page document is prepared by Lucky Montana, the guy who denied that he bought toll trains, which were toll trains, by the way. But the last pathology involves me and you. One is civil society tends to bystand until things get worse. But the other real pathology for me is we think good guys are always good and bad guys are always bad. And therefore we create untouchables, and then we create people who are almost persecuted because everything they do, we go for them. And then those that we like, we never question what they do. And that, for me, creates a problem. So what's the stake? Democracy is in distress, and you know that democracy is derailed. And what are glimmers of shifts? I do think that there is a shift, not yet seismic, but there is a shift. In South Africa, we have a state capture that has come up with a lot of disclosures. And it's not just the commission, it's also other state capture investigations. And some of those have already been concluded in courts of law, like the matter that involved some international companies. There's also a campaign that has started in South Africa where people are saying, I'm staying. And some of my colleagues are saying, if I'm staying, will also include how do I make it work? So I'm staying, but how do I make it work? Because I'm on this boat. If it sinks, I'm going to go down. I may not be the first to go down, but down you will go. And then we just had a social justice summit, and Ben Turok wrote an article afterwards remarking about how amazing it was that there was consensus on what kind of country are we building. Almost the same thing as what has happened at the level of the UN with the Sustainable Development Goals. Everyone has now agreed that a world where some sit on the shoulders on others is not sustainable. And for sustainable development to happen, or for sustainable environment to happen, we need to make sure there's social justice. So hence the SDGs include anti-poverty, anti-hunger, anti-inequality, and they also include preserving our environment. I think in South Africa, during the summit, there was that moment where there was agreement on what kind of country are we building, and it was going to be a country where there's inclusiveness, socio-economic inclusiveness at all levels of society and in all sectors of life. So for me, that was a good thing. So what are conditions for redemption? We do need a paradigm shift from those three pathologies I mentioned. We do need a detoxing after state capture. I also think we really need shift moments. One of the things that worked under Madiba was that there were moments of euphoria where we just get a feeling that we're doing things right. That also a sense that we're a team. And there were two key moments where he really ignited the spirit. The one was when Chris Hani died. Instead of, being a predator and stealing that moment to gain votes, he used it as a nation-building moment. The second one was Rugby World Cup. Many South Africans hated the rugby jersey because it was a symbol of division, but he turned that into a symbol of unity when he walked into that stadium in 1995 wearing jersey number 6. And at the end of it all, when he and Francois Pienaar embraced, it was a moment the nation embraced. We do need something like that. Will it be the M plan for social justice? I don't know. So far, the Social Justice Summit did that. And the M plan for social justice is something like a Marshall Plan, post-World War II Marshall Plan, and it's named after Palesa Musa, the young lady who is no longer so young, who is poor today, not because she doesn't work hard, because the system spits her and people like her out. And we need to find a way to help people like her to lift themselves up and to integrate into all levels of society. And key to that is leveraging data analytics for better policy planning, leveraging social capital within civil society to drive social cohesion and to drive social accountability. And lastly, social mobilization for financing the change, and which includes even getting international friends like yourself. Well, what's the next chapter for South Africa and for the world around governance and social justice? Is there a conflict between injustice and governance? Personally, I think yes. As long as there's injustice somewhere, there can't be sustainable peace anywhere. And to function properly as a country, everyone should feel vested in it. And when I look at our generation, generations before us may have messed up, but there's always something they gave. If you look at Eleanor Roosevelt group post-World War, they did give us the UN, they did give us the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If you look at the Mandela generation, well, Nkrumah generation, I would include them with the Eleanor. The Nkrumah generation, they gave Africa freedom, at least political freedom. The Mandela generation gave us political freedom plus a constitution, which is a basis for moving forward. They didn't sell us dreams, because the Constitution does not say you've now become a free society, an equal society. It's not a magic wand. It's a basis for building that society. The question I think that arises for all of us is generations are always straddled, or they straddle. So right now it's my generation. It is the millennials, it is the Z generation, and the question is, these generation, our time, what are we going to leave? Because every generation has an opportunity and responsibility to make the next chapter of its community a better one. We have these instruments, we have sustainable development goals. What are we going to do to truly bring about a world that is inclusive to all? And in so doing, save democracy and peace. Thank you.
Well, I think we have at least 25 minutes for questions. So I know I have a lot of questions, but I imagine there's several people in the audience already with a question on their mind. Do we have any hands up here? I would say please speak into a microphone so that people on the live streaming can hear you.
Thank you. Hi, Madonsela. My name is Kanya, and my question is, So in South Africa, I led an enterprise and supply development fund for one of the corporates. And what I saw there is that the reality of policy versus implementation is very real. And my question is linked to the point that you were making around equality, where you were talking about the blues and the pinks. What, in your view, is an appropriate or justified disruptor to bring equality?
Wow, Kanya, that's a very difficult question. I would say your disruption should be multiple level. One should be just acts of goodwill. For example, when Madiba drove those shift moments, he took some risks. in fact, he wasn't the first. When de Klerk decided to release Mandela so suddenly, that was a shift moment. That was a disruptive moment. I would say it would take individual acts. Somebody's announcing and saying, I have a farm and I think I would like to subdivide it and help. Or I have a company, I want to invest in the poorest of the 4,392 municipalities to uplift this community. With the M Plan for Social Justice, we hope that it will have a disruptive effect in that the first thing is that they will use data analytics to plan policies better. Instead of finding out that a policy will exacerbate the inequality of older persons or rural people or females or people with disabilities, after we've implemented it over a long period of time, you will find out by implementing it in the virtual space, you could even use algorithms to do that. And then you realize, oh, this is how this policy will impact on people with disabilities, on LGBTI, on women. And then rethink that policy, maybe have a compensation strategy or come up with a new policy. So that hopefully will be one disruptor. The financing for change. At the moment, we've always said finance must come from government. Yes, without corruption, we would have had more money. That's true. But the truth is, even if we had had all of the money that government could raise, there still would not have been enough money. So we were wrong, and I've discussed this with Mr. de Klerk, who agrees with me and many others, that we should have had a civil society fund, which is what the M Plan, one of the key result areas of the M Plan is that when people go to buy at a retail shop, they will be asked if they would like to donate a small amount of money. Could be something like 2 Rand or 5 Rand, and which will then go to a fund. Initially, we thought it could be invested in sectors, but I think what is emerging now is that rather invest it in education and SDG initiatives at municipal ward level. Because one of the mistakes we do with development is we treat people as statistics. When I spoke about statistics of poverty, for example, I said in the country it's 55.5% across group. But if you disaggregate it, 1% among whites, 64.2% among blacks of African descent. 6% among those classified as Asians, 38% among those classified as colored. But the Eastern Cape, one of the provinces, poverty at 72%. So in a country where you're trying to get everyone to buy into democracy, you have a problem. So part of the disruption is civil society stepping up. And I have seen civil society beginning to step up. A lot of it is that it's at individual level and also CSI by companies. I think I'll be addressing CSI companies next week or in the coming weeks. One of the mistakes is it's not epic driven. It's not ethical, purpose-driven, impact-conscious, and committed to serve. It is really directed at making sure we get those BEE points, we get the compliance point. I'll tell you an interesting story. One of my kids gets called by a friend who works for one of the big companies in South Africa, huge company. Hey, friend, can you please organize 30 black entrepreneurs for me next week? I need to come and train 30 black entrepreneurs. The request is coming on Friday, the training is on Monday. So of course they just pick up any random person who qualifies as a black entrepreneur, and it could be somebody who's already attended 50 similar trainings and gets into the group. They get to sign, we've trained 50 black entrepreneurs from Kayamandi. But what shifted? No needle moved, because it was not ethical, it was not purpose-driven, it wasn't impact-conscious, and it was really not committed to serve. Yeah, thank you.
Question down here, I think.
Good evening and welcome to this place. So the I mean, it's safe to say that the systematic looting of state resources has eroded trust in state institutions and state capacity to address a lot of the social challenges that South Africa faces. And your report into state capture was perhaps singular in bringing all those allegations to the fore. So perhaps how important was that investigation and the accompanying Zondo Commission into state capture? And then what do you say to the frustrations that people feel that the wheels of justice have not been turning fast enough for those who were involved in the project of capture? Right.
Well, thank you, Suta, for that question. By the way, Suta comes from the same university that I come from, and they're helping us with reviewing the South Africa's economic pathways using this kind of approach that looks at data analytics and that looks at what is likely to be the impact on poverty and inequality. So the investigation into state capture was important, and I like the fact that you have highlighted the fact that my report only brought to the fore allegations. And that was all it was supposed to do. It was supposed to get the nation to understand that you have a monster here, potentially. Let's look into it. It might well be that it's not a monster. It may well be that there's no state capture, but the way it looks at the moment, it's a monster, and it's going to eat our democracy for breakfast. And so that's all it was supposed to do, and the Commission of Inquiry was supposed to do just that. I believe that courts function very well because both the courts of justice and the courts of public opinion are important, because people start thinking about what's eating our nation, what's eating our democracy, but also witnesses also come to the fore, as has happened in the State Capture Commission. For those who are despairing, I would say they shouldn't despair, because think about it. We consent that the process is slow. Yes, it may be slow, but it is a process. If there was no process, can you imagine where we would be by now? People complain right now and say, what happened to the new dawn? Dawn is the beginning of a day. And obviously, those of us who grew up in farms, I partly grew up in Swaziland, and farming, there's a season for rooting out whatever is dead from the previous season, and then cultivating something new, and then your seeds will be germinating, and then something new comes up. So the State Capture Commission at this stage is about rooting out whatever is not working, whatever is rotting. And in the meantime, at the same time, there is an attempt to rebuild the economy. And I don't think that is going to work overnight. I think, but it will need thinking out of the box. And it will need not those old, tired economists who think invest in a few, they will carry the rest. It's not going to work. Yes.
Janice. Oh, sorry. Both of you.
Good evening, Professor Madonsela. My name is Leander. My question goes to what you were talking about earlier, the use of the Constitution as a framework or as a tool for, at the very least, progressively achieving equality. But part of the tension that exists within South African society at the moment is that a lot of people see the Constitution as a tool, but would argue that it perhaps needs revision simply because it's not achieving those aims. For example, years after the Grootboom case, which I'm sure you'd be familiar with, we are still dealing with the consequences of trying to get people access to adequate housing. The state knows about Grootboom, for example. They're very familiar with the case, but you generally see across the board and across all levels of state that there's a very slow response to achieving those sort of constitutional ends. So what would be your response to people who see the Constitution as something that needs to be revised in order to perhaps kickstart or create a new radical way of achieving the kind of aims and the kind of equality you're speaking about?
What's the name, sir? Thank you. Leander, I'm not against constitutional reform per se. I worry about the reason constitutional reform is being suggested in South Africa. It is our failure to implement what we already have. Yes, Grootboom said Ms. Grootboom should get a house, and she died without one. But what stopped social accountability from following it up? Let's just take the approach in Grootboom versus the approach in basic education for all, BIFA, I call it BIFA case, take the Grootboom approach versus the BIFA case. With the BIFA case, it's basic education for all. Civil society did not decide to become consumers. They understood that democracy is the government of the people, for the people, by the people. That as a Democrat and as a citizen, your job does not start and end with casting the ballot. Your job starts with getting involved in policy formulations, appointing people, electing people, following up step by step. So in the BIFA case, Section 27 sued government. Section 27 is an NGO that sued government for not delivering books in the Limpopo province in South Africa. And a year later, I think by 2013, whereas the Section 27 case was in 2012, by 2013, there were still books, there were still places without books. And government's first response was, everyone has a book. If there isn't social accountability is us making ourselves the ultimate accounting authority, because we have elected these people, they account to us. Because the BIFA was a coalition of principals, governing boards, etc. And working with Section 27, they went to the schools and audited. And they found a discrepancy between what government claimed to have delivered and what it had delivered. And guess what? When this matter went to court, then government shifted its story. Oh, we didn't have enough money. But they had agreed that they were going to deliver. And, the Constitution does not guarantee every child a book. No, but the Constitution guarantees every child the right to education, and therefore, if we both have a right to education, it has to be delivered in the same content. My right can't be delivered in less than yours, and then the equality clause. Human dignity, those children the teachers had to go to neighboring schools to borrow books and then write the content on the board. It was chaotic, but government went to a court of law to defend that and say it's not. And then the last argument, which defies logic, was anyway, there are books that have not been delivered, but it's not the same number as claimed by BIFA. Who cares? There's still some children that don't have books. But what I'm saying is that's not a failure of democracy. I think our democracy was not meant to be a situation where we outsource all democratic processes to lawyers and judges. It was supposed to be a polycentric accountability framework, which is multiple center accountability framework. So there was supposed to be political accountability. That's through the ballot box and parliamentary process, judicial or legal accountability through the courts, administrative accountability through the Public Human Rights Commission, Auditor General, etc., social accountability through me, you, and you, and what we call professional accountability, we're professional bodies. So if all of these really were to work, I would say then maybe you need to change the Constitution. But the other people who want to change the Constitution are people who say the land provisions haven't worked. And nothing works if you don't make it work. I mean, honestly, if you buy medicine, your doctor prescribes, gives you medicine, you come home, you put your medicine in the cupboard, and then you come back and you say, this prescription was wrong. that's not right. And that's what has happened. So as we speak, the Section 25 was never fully implemented in terms of transforming the land management system. It's only now that they're now coming up with a holistic land redistribution and land sharing strategy. So personally, I think we have not exhausted the gifts that are given in the Constitution. We're like that man who died poor, and then when he was dead, his brothers came to collect his remains, and then they found a box which had been a gift to him, and he had never opened it, and there were riches in that box. Thank you.
So yeah, Janice had a question.
Hi, thank you very much, Professor. I'm Janice in the Politics Department. I'm just following up on the comment you made earlier about the old economists. And my question's got more to do with question of power than of law. So my concern is, how do we create the kind of just society on the level that we need to, when many of the issues that are preventing that are not necessarily issues that are about illegality or corruption per se, but that are sort of embedded in the very system and the very structures of our laws, of our institutions, of our policies, and that work somehow alongside this beautiful constitution and these beautiful enabling policies we have. But we can't necessarily hold these very powerful networks to account. So even if it doesn't look like illegal corruption, we have, like you said, some of the key people who were sponsoring early policies, some of the key advisors to the economic system. They're members of very, very powerful networks of elites who have huge incentive to maintain and entrench their advantages, and who've managed, both through their advantages in wealth and their advantages in network, to include some new elites within that, sure, but to really entrench their own power and their own wealth. And so I'm sort of wondering, how do we deal with that in terms of governance when it might not look like Nkandla, but when there isn't, when there's huge opposition in terms of monopoly capital, in terms of heads of different institutions and captains of industry who would heavily oppose any kind of really bold economic structural policy change that we would need to see, the kind of change that we want to see to see a more just, a more dignified, a more equal society. And even, not just those informal elites, but they even go to, like you were saying, some of our authorities. I read today that the city of Cape Town's just told a woman that they're increasing her rent by 2,000% next month. A very poor woman who's lived in her home for decades. And this isn't, it's being challenged, but it's not necessarily illegal. So how do we deal with those issues of power and who have large incentives to oppose more just policies by more bold and radical economists? Thanks.
Well, thank you. Janice?
Janice, yeah.
Thank you, Janice. I think the starting point is to engage with the powers that be about building a just society. I think the problem with many societies, including mine, is we talk about building an economy. So that's just the wrong starting point, is that we're building an economy, whereas we're supposed to be building a society. That's what the Constitution says. And then we look at what kind of economy would serve the society we're building. And that gospel is not going to be immediately accepted. My view is we start by looking at potential influencers on the other side. And you're right that there are people who are believable, and I don't think they're evil. I think a whole lot of people don't even understand that I'm advising because I have a vested interest. I just use the paradigm of the world, the prism of life that I have, And I genuinely think this is the way things should go. I mean, a lot of business people invite me. When I started talking to them, all they thought needed to happen in South Africa was people should be given jobs. You have a pyramid system where your bottom poor is black, and you saying the only change you need is to give them job and education and keep the whole system intact. You're building a threat to democracy, because as long as there's injustice somewhere, there can't be sustainable peace anywhere. And somebody said, for example, the other day, a student said, hungry ears can't hear. And in Zulu we say, hunger causes anger, and sociologists call it hunger, that when people are hungry, they tend to be angry. But literally, when you're hungry, you do tend to be on a short fuse. So I think we need then to engage those who have power, including economic power, in understanding the unintended consequences of their worldview. And we can find some of them. If you look at how the women's movement succeeded in this country and ours, with a partnership between some slightly enlightened men and the women's movement. Here, for example, John Stuart Mill was one of those people who was slightly enlightened on gender, and that was leveraged. In South Africa, Jan Smarts was slightly enlightened. I'm a lawyer today because Olive Schreiner used that relationship she had with Jan Smarts, who was racist, who had other problems, but you can't find a person who is good in everything. So leverage some of these things. For example, in business now, we're here to attend One Young World. One of the business people who's making changes in the world is Paul Pullman from Unilever. And Unilever is not like cleaner than everyone. They probably might have a mistake here and there, but he's made undertakings around disability inclusion, gender inclusion, and it's just generally saying that the corporations can't build their wealth on pain and suffering. That's not sustainable. And corporations can't build their wealth on environmental degradation, because that's not sustainable. And he walked the talk. He decided that any investor who wants me to do the wrong thing, they can keep their money. And temporarily, Unilever lost some investors. But in the end, it worked. Same thing as Nike, They've decided they're going to make a bold stand against racism. They've lost some, but what it means is we need to knock at people's doors. Because when we lock all of them on the other side with hashtags such as men are trash, for example, or gender issues, for me, I don't think that helps us, because we lose a potential John Stuart Mill who's on the other side, a potential Mandela who's on the other side. Whereas if we engage, Carver talks about paradigms in that book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, that we see the world based on where we've been. We don't mean to be evil. And he even puts a picture there, which I have tried on people. And some see a young woman, some see an old woman. And people argue until they turn blue, insisting that there's a young woman. How can you not see this young woman? And the one who sees an old woman would say, how on earth can you not see the old woman? And then as you go to the other side of the book, you explained that actually there's both a young woman and an old woman. I think we have to engage until people can see the picture that we're seeing, that if we want sustainable democracies, if we want a continuously peaceful world, democracy must work for all. Thank you.
Does anyone have a burning question? No, go for it. I think we have time for one more.
Hi, my name is Farah. I work in the health sector in South Africa, which is at the forefront of experiencing a lot of those symptoms in a very harsh way of social injustices within the country. to build trust within governance. And sure, there's actions that have to follow that. But here we are in health on the brink of a reform that has the potential to be a real example for addressing social injustices in an entire sector. How do you attract the right people to governance, and how do you build trust in the system?
Wonderful. You're right that when it comes to, what's your name, ma'am? Farah. Farah, you're right that when it comes to trusting the public service, people just generally think people who work for government are dishonest, corrupt, and lazy. Having worked in government and having worked with government people, including my days as a pub protector, I can still confirm that the average civil servant works beyond the call of duty to try and make a difference. And the average civil servant is honest and just try to do the right thing. But partly what has happened is that those who drop the ball, whether by being corrupt or being rude and dishonest, they drop the ball so badly that it becomes news. In Zulu we say, bad news travel faster than good news. And the media also is more likely to pick up on the bad news. And then you're asking, how do we turn that around? We need a shift moment around that. There is an organization from India that is trying to root in South Africa as well. They have something that is called Integrity Idol. And that was supposed to try and valorize people in government who do good things. But in the army, they say that if you point out a problem, you're volunteering to solve it. Because if you already see there's a problem, so I just think, Farah, you might just come up with a solution. And One Young World is an organization that is really encouraging your generation. Because you already are solving problems. I think all research has shown that millennials do not like injustice. They do not like to do what Phil Collins says, you look the other way. Because clearly in my generation probably didn't like injustice. It's just look the other way when you feel uncomfortable walking around a sea of poverty when you yourself are doing better. So I think the next thing, though, is for the young generation to transcend analysis paralysis and go into solutions. For example, one of the young people I quoted, Chikane, he talks about how older people dropped the ball and waited for young people. I disagree with him. I hear that from young people, and I say Mandela's generation delivered something very concrete: political freedom and democracy, and this groundbreaking constitution. What are we going to deliver? We may well try now to find ways to firstly get young people, Lindiwe Mazibuko and the Tuma Foundation, which is one organization that I'm linked to, they're training young people in various kinds of leadership. Tuma, for example, has created this leadership model that is called epic leadership, and we're seeing young people changing, ethical, purpose-driven, impact-conscious, and committed to serve, and encouraging them to go into government. And some of them that are being trained are already in government, and with the hope that in addition to building trust in government, we are going to feed government with people who are trustworthy. Thank you.
Well, I think that's a fantastic point to leave it. Before we all say thank you to Professor Madonsela, I just want to say there's a talk in a few days, and hopefully Jolie can remember when Blair Glencourse is coming from Integrity Idol. Is it Wednesday or Thursday? Wednesday. So we'll be discussing issues of corruption and trust in institutions then, and I really encourage you to come. But can we all thank our fantastic speaker, Professor Madonsela? And there are drinks outside.